Good morning. Today's reading is from Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated.
Good morning, Refuge family. Whoever thought that I am the sole preacher who drinks all the time through my sermon, and so I need something handy to put my drink on, whoever thoughtfully put that there, thank you very much. There's a couple things that definitely will happen during the sermon today, if there even is a sermon. I will be drinking quite frequently. And if you want to turn it into your own drinking game, that's cool with me. Like, every time I go for something, if you want to join me in that moment, that would be amazing for me. Yes, I see you, brother. Thank you. And the second thing is, I think I'm going to cry at some point for any number of reasons. Just let me have my moment, and I'll try to regain my composure and keep talking as I'm able. I love just how understated this church tends to be. Just a few minutes ago, you heard David say that there is a one agenda business meeting coming. David is the agenda of that meeting. If you don't know, Refuge has been in a pastoral interim, and so today, finally, there will be a vote to affirm David as our lead pastor. We've already sung, all my life you have been faithful. But how faithful has God been to this church in that interim? And it moves me. It's beautiful. That wasn't even the thing that I thought would make me cry, for that matter. There's a lot going on, both in my mind, my heart, my soul, my mouth. Let me ask you a question as we start our time together. What does David say when we want the lights to show faces? Scene 2? Is this already scene 2? Is that scene 2? Can I ask you a question? Who are you here with this morning? I see some fingers pointing. I can see who's next to you. That's almost not the point, but how do you answer that question for yourself? Who are you here with? I mean, take a look around. Actually look around. Like, I can see your heads. Look around. Name some faces, and I'm sure as you look around, are there not some people that you don't know their names? So are you here with them or just somehow adjacent to them in this space? What does it mean when we gather together in worship? Are we with each other as one family? Or are we here as any number of individual people gathered for the same reason, but not quite with each of us together? All right, here we go. Simon, I forgot how old you are. Can you tell me? 23. So I'm about to tell a story about when I was 21, and I just wanted you to picture somebody that doesn't look like this when I was just a young man. But while I have your focus on, no, I need that light. While I have your focus on Simon and Brianna, would you guys stand up? Can I embarrass you for just a moment? This time next week, they will be Mr. and Mrs. They're getting married on Friday. So thank you. We celebrate with you. We are glad to share that moment with you in whatever way, and we are joyfully rooting for you through all of it. And I pray that it's unstressful all the way through, all the details come together. And then Matt and Jess, stand up, you guys too. Do you guys know them? There are these two couples that have been on the track to get married for many months, and they almost always sit together. And so just, was it 3 weeks after Simon and Brianna, they will also be getting married. And so we are also praying for you and rooting for you. So yeah, these are some of the people in your neighborhood, as it were, and they are with us. And if I could continue to point out stories and just raise situations in the spotlight, I would, but I don't think that would be altogether appropriate. You can turn that light off now. When I was 21 years old, this is August 1994, at a church called Cataract City Bible Church. Cataract City is Niagara Falls. It's right near where I grew up in Buffalo. I had been invited to preach, and I preached as a 21-year-old long enough that my friend Butch, who put a boombox halfway down the aisle, recording me on a cassette tape, because that was the 90s. It was a 45-minute tape, and he flipped it, and then it stopped again, and I was still going. So when I was 21, I knew a lot more than I do now. So I was preaching this sermon about wholeheartedly following Jesus as a disciple and about taking up your cross and following Jesus. And at the end of that sermon, I gave an altar call. And as I picture it in my memory, it wasn't much bigger than this, the front of the church. And when I gave the altar call, I don't know if it was a move of the Spirit or just people overwhelmingly grateful that I was done talking, but people just flooded up to the front. I mean, there was like 40 people scattered throughout this front and crying and praying together in that moment. And in that moment, the pastor of the church came, and he was wrapping things up. He was standing to my left, and he said something to me that was simultaneously so affirming and so damaging at the same time. He said to me, "Gary, never forget that a man of God walks alone." Never forget that a man of God walks alone. What was he doing? He was affirming me in some way as a prophetic voice, like an Elijah, who would speak the truth in a way that would call people to it. And so he wanted me to know that he saw me in that way, but what he was also doing was underlining that sense of individualism, that somehow a man of God could walk alone, even though God has called us all to walk together. Even though Elijah himself on the mountain was sad and depressed, and God came to him and said, "Why are you sad and depressed?" "Because I'm alone." And so God had to tell him, there's still 3,000 other prophets out there that have not bent the knee to Baal. Elijah, you're not alone. I wonder how many of us have a sense of that isolation, of that aloneness in our following of Jesus. When I ask you who you are with, here's another way to ask that question. Who in the room are you responsible for? Who else in the room, not just are you responsible for, but they are also responsible for you as you walk with God in some way? Do you bear any responsibility at all for the person on the other side of this room whose name you don't know, or the person down the aisle that you've met once, or even your family who are right next to you, your mother, your father, your son, your daughter? Who do you bear responsibility for? We've been talking for some time, the last several weeks, about the Sabbath. And there's one note that we've not yet talked about. And it was heard in the scripture that Karen read for us earlier. But I think we've heard it so many times that we no longer hear it. Let me recap somewhat. We'll take a running start, and let me underline what you heard but did not hear. For the last several weeks, as we've been talking about what the Bible has to say about Sabbath, the first time we glimpse what the day of rest might be, we see it in the account of creation in the book of Genesis, where God himself organizes time into 7 things. There's 6 days of work and 1 day of rest when he delighted in creation and said, "This is all so very good." And then we explored how when God was fashioning a people, calling the people of Israel out of Egypt, he brought them to the Mount Sinai and gave them his law. And part of that law was the 10 Commandments. And God commanded them in that moment that when they go into their own land and become his own people, part of what they need to do altogether is keep the Sabbath day holy, to stop work and rest. Jesus would later then reframe our view of the Sabbath from kind of that sense of a binding obligation to being a gracious gift. He says the Sabbath was made for you, not you for the Sabbath. And so as you enter into Sabbath, Sabbath is a reminder to you that you belong to God and not Pharaoh. You can rest under his care. You can find delight in all that God has given you. Sabbath is then a reminder that you can trust God to be patient with everything that is unresolved in your heart, if I can use Rainer Maria Rilke's phrase. And then just last week, David talked to us about Sabbath as a counterformative practice, which is to say that we have values in our bodies, we have values in our bones that we have not chosen. And the Sabbath comes to pull us out of that form and shape us into a people who look like we are trusting God with our lives. So just like it was for Israel, who had to unlearn 400 years of slavery, the day of rest that we're invited into is a practice that pushes back against the deforming pressures of our own time, the unrelenting busyness of our time. The last thing that I want to underline this morning, the one point of this sermon, is that if Sabbath is going to be real, it needs to be shared. Sabbath rest isn't Sabbath unless it is shared. What do I mean? Sabbath teaches us to look around, to see each other, to see our community. It pushes it back, not just against our preoccupation with our own life and schedule and anxieties, but it pushes us back to look at those around us, to consider how we might not just find our own rest, but how might we be called to provide and protect the rest of others. So in that sense, the question at hand this morning as we continue through this series on Sabbath is not whether you as an individual or you as a family, you as a couple will choose to practice Sabbath. It is really, how will we as a community of people following Jesus Christ in Albuquerque, how will we as Refuge Church honor the Sabbath together as one family? How ironic it is that I'm feeling the pressure of time in this moment. We have a commitment to our children's area to be done by a certain time for their sake, because we want to honor their time. And so I'm editing and reshaping things as I look at these words on a paper. We should have a slide that puts up the 10 Commandments. Carter, can you put that up for me? When you think about the way the 10 Commandments were given, there's something really interesting to me. There's 9 commandments that looks like you can keep these entirely by yourself. Don't kill somebody, don't steal anything, don't commit adultery, don't covet, etc. It relates to how you worship God and God only. But then the Sabbath commandment stands off by itself. In the text of Exodus says this, that remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. You can't actually hear that commandment without having to name those who are around you in your family, your business, your community. This one commandment only, you can't keep it by yourself. You have to look outward. You have to look to the people around you, even the animals around you. And so God is saying to the people of Israel, you actually carry some responsibility for those under your influence around you to keep them free to obey this commandment as well. When I was reading that text this week, it reminded me of those moments we have as parents. I walk into perhaps my living room and I see my son Donovan watching television, and I might say, Donovan, you've been on the TV long enough, find something else to do, and then I walk away. And I come back 10 minutes later, and what is Donovan doing? Well, he's playing a video game. And I said, Donovan, I told you to get off the TV. And his answer is what? It's not the TV. I'm playing a video game. And so suddenly, as a parent, you feel like you have to go through and identify and name and prohibit all of the loopholes. No phone, no laptop, no switch, no TV. Don't even see your reflection in a mirror. Just find something to do. The Sabbath command sounds like that to me, like God preempting somebody's efforts to get around the heart of this commandment. A person might not be able to work for themselves, but maybe they're thinking, I could have my kids do it. Or I could hire somebody else to do it. He's not even Jewish, he's just passing through. Or I'm not working, my animals are working. But no, God insists that the day of rest should be a day of rest for everybody in the community, even those who just happen to be passing through. That's remarkable. So Sabbath requires us to look around, to think about how we might provide and protect the rest of others in our community. Those people that you looked at, what responsibility do you have to care for them? Are you, in fact, your brother or sister's keeper in this way? So, there is a quick story from the book of Nehemiah, and then we're going to finish in a flash. You're going to love it. I told somebody before the service that I was cutting 3/4 of the first page, and he gave me a thumbs up. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But you know what? Whatever minutes I don't use this week, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks I'm up again. I'll just save them for that, and we'll be good. So in the book of Nehemiah, the exiles have come back from Babylon, and Nehemiah is overseeing the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And he's watching, and what's happening is there's activity going on during the Sabbath that is against the rules of the Sabbath. The people of Israel, having been in exile for 7 years, have to relearn what it is to keep the Sabbath. And so he looks out into the city, and he says, in those days I saw people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They were bringing in grain, loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, all these other things. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. So what did he do? He did two things. One, he rebuked the people because they had forgotten the law of Moses to keep the Sabbath. And then secondly, he put guards at every gate of the city right before the Sabbath would begin. They closed the gates, and he stationed guards so that no outside merchant could come in, nor could you take your goods outside the city to sell to somebody else. And after he did that, he said once or twice he witnessed merchants and sellers camped by those gates who were they were planning on spending the night there, so as soon as the gates opened, they could go in and sell. But when he saw them there, he warned the merchants that if he caught them there again, he would arrest them. This is like this ancient get off my lawn moment with Nehemiah. And you see what he's doing. If there's people at the gates and the people see them there, they would begin to anticipate the commerce that they wanted to engage in the next day. And he would send them away because you cannot delight in rest if you're already living in tomorrow, trade or consumption or whatever. How do we protect a day of rest and stay in it for 1 day, for 2 hours, for 4 hours, wherever you want to begin? How do we protect this for each other? In this matter of keeping the Sabbath, are you actually your brother and sister's keeper? And if you are, how do you guard their Sabbath rest? I think the short answer to the first question is yes, you are actually your brother and sister's keeper in this matter of keeping the Sabbath. If Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves, and our neighbor is attempting to keep the Sabbath in some particularly intentional way, do we not show our love for them? Even if we don't have a practice ourselves, do we not show love for them by helping them, as it were, guard the gate? That's the short answer. The longer answer is that this series that we're in will raise the question, because admittedly, those of us in this congregation, we're mixed in our approach to what we will or will not do on the Sabbath. What does shared Sabbath responsibility look like here when some of us already have an established 24-hour Sabbath practice? Some of us are experimenting. Some of us are trying to figure out how to restructure our time to make it even possible, much less repeatable. And some of us don't have any Sabbath practice at all, aside from gathering here in this moment to worship together. That's the question. How do we learn to honor the Sabbath for our brothers and sisters who are keeping it, for our brothers and sisters who have not yet begun to keep it? How do we love each other? Only. One, if Sabbath is a day of shared rest, start there. Share rest. Share rest. So those of you who have a Sabbath practice, who have learned in some way how to receive the day, how to rest, would you begin to consider what it might look like to invite somebody else to experience it with you? Like whatever that looks like for you, sharing an unhurried meal, the simpler the better. Sharing conversations, gathering for a brunch, taking a walk together, even just an evening of unplanned time. I learned a few weeks ago this is a crowd that has some appreciation for whiskey. Maybe your Sabbath looks like sharing whiskey in appropriate amounts. And if I just made eye contact with you, I'm not implying anything about your whiskey practice. Sharing good things. But those of you who have learned how to rest, how might you gift it to somebody else? If Sabbath is a gift to you, how might you then gift it to someone else and share it? And then secondly, as part of sharing rest, I said there were 2 points. This is actually 1A. If you have a practice or are beginning a Sabbath practice, talk about it. Let your friends know when it is and what you intend to do so that they know. Even if you yourself don't have a practice, even if they don't have a practice, they might help you protect yours. For example, as staff, we know that David and Sadie enter into Sabbath Friday evening to Saturday evening, so we share that with them by helping them protect their time by not texting or calling during that window. Instead, we might email them so that David can pick it up when he has time after the Sabbath is over. We learn together what can wait a day to be addressed. So if you hear from somebody else in your circle that they're observing a Sabbath in some way, your response should not be, well, that's good for you. Your response should be, how might I protect that time, that moment for them because I love them as my brother and sister? Point 1, share rest. Point 2, share worship together. Share worship. It wasn't long before there was a regular Sabbath practice of worship together in synagogues when Israel was formed. And that practice formed into what we now know as worship on the Lord's Day for the Christian church. Worship and the day off, whether it's Saturday or Sunday, have always been tied together. So if you think you have no Sabbath practice, you still have this. And so in this moment, when we come together, how might we share in worship? In Luke 10, right after the story of the Good Samaritan, we see Jesus go into the house of Martha, and Martha does what you might expect someone to do with unexpected visitors. She gets busy. She starts preparing a meal. She starts making preparations to accommodate all the people that are now in her home. But there's a contrast in the room because her sister Mary, instead of helping her with the work, she goes to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen. Martha, scurrying, busy, anxious, troubled about many things, goes to Jesus and says, will you please tell my sister to help me? And Jesus instead says, no, Mary has chosen the better part. There is so much necessary work every Sunday to make this worship service what it is, what we experience and share together. There are so many little jobs that volunteers do week after week after week. From making our coffee, thanks be to God for them, and greeting people at the door. There is a prayer team that pray before the service, and they're here for you after the service. Sometimes they pray with you during the service. There are people in this auditorium, this room, that bake bread for the communion table. I see Leanne and Nate out there. I love that when we get to share bread that has been baked by members of our own community. There are people that will come and serve to each other the bread and the cup. There's 3 people serving the bread and cup today for the first time. There are people teaching children down the halls. There are people who care for babies. There are people who put up slides. people who run a camera for those who aren't here, and we could name so many more. How do we let them be Marys even in the work and not Marthas? Refuge staff, leaders who run teams of volunteers. How might we love our brothers and sisters on this Sabbath practice of worship? I think we can honor these brothers and sisters who willingly step forward to do these things for us by not asking them to do too much or to do it too often, by respecting their boundaries, by giving them good training so that the work itself is not anxious. But it's our job as people who love them to have eyes on them so that even in the middle of that work, they might be free, to be non-anxious, to be non-hurried, to be listening for the voice of Jesus as they serve and not be anxious about all that feels necessary. And for those of you who are neither leading a team or on a team, you might be asking, what can I do? How do I also share? You might consider finding some way in which you can share in a given week and thus take that away from somebody else for that 1 week, right? You can learn to make coffee, you can greet at the doors, you can serve communion. There's so many ways that we can participate as family together in these worship moments. Can I call you to find a way, not so that we can fill our schedule, but so that we might serve each other and keep each other rested and non-anxious and not worried? Sabbath teaches us to view our community as a we. We keep Sabbath. Worship teaches us the same thing. We gather, we worship together with each other, not just adjacent to each other. And every week when we come, do we not finish here at this table with the bread and the cup out in front of us? And what does this practice announce to us week after week after week? It is not just that Jesus died for our sins, but that we come together, invited by the one Lord Jesus Christ, to be one community, one family, coming to this one table, taking the one bread and the one cup, announcing to us that we are one. We are with not just each other, but with the whole family of God. If those of you who are serving would come, let's walk into that moment now.